obvious like a lot has changed in my lifetime the last 70 years. And even though it covers 70 years, in the grand scheme of history, it's just a very short time. It's insignificant. It's like a moment. Now, every once in a while, the U.S. Supreme Court issues a ruling which fundamentally changes our society. For me, the first such ruling came in May of 1954. I remember the moment I learned about it. I was in 8th grade social studies. And the case was Brown versus the Board of Education. And that was the case, thank you, Earl Warren, that outlawed segregation in public schools. It was very meaningful to me, especially going to segregated schools. And my parents were 100% against segregation. I always knew that that was wrong. So I welcomed this decision even as an 8th grader. And when the Brown versus Board of Education decision was announced, we all knew that it was a big deal and that life would somehow change. But we had no idea how that was going to happen. And it wasn't until Johnson and the Civil Rights Act of the mid to the late 1960s that integration actually occurred. And it had to be forced, and you all remember how that happened. It wasn't pretty. Many people were killed throughout the South. But it was worth it because it changed our society forever, and I think for the better. The South today is a different place. I spend a lot of time there. My wife is from New Orleans. We go back every year. I'm going in 3 weeks and 1 day, November 6th. I can't wait. Okay. And when we go, we just don't visit family, but I like to go around and check out Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia and see how things are. And this is how things are. Today, if you drive through the rural South, you're going to see a white kid on a bicycle riding a black kid on the handlebars. You will see that. And you will see at the schoolyard a pickup baseball game with black and white kids. And they play together, they live together. You will see them eating at restaurants. And you'll also see, if you go into a restaurant, which I did, in Thibodaux, Louisiana. Interesting place on Bayou Lafourche, okay, in the middle of nowhere. And I walk into a restaurant, and there's this elderly guy, probably in his 80s or 90s, and he's spouting off about the, pardon me for using this word, but I will, because that's what he said. He's spouting off about the niggers. The niggers this and the niggers that. And they're lazy, they don't work in the summer because they're drinking, and they don't work in the winter because whatever, and just on and on and on. And 2 young construction workers walk into the restaurant, one black, one white, perhaps 25. And they're obviously a team working for a utility company. And they take a look at this old guy who's doddering away with his racism, and they look at him. I looked at them, they looked at me, and they go, they ordered, and they moved as far away from him as they possibly could. And the young black people and the young white people were together. You wouldn't have seen that 20, 30, 40 years ago, but you see it every day now in the South. Now, when you have a fundamental change in a social structure, it takes a very long time. It took a long time to implement civil rights laws, and now here we are 58 years later, we still have a very, very long way to go. Obtaining a societal change is very complicated. I'll give you an example. My father-in-law was a fine Southern man. He was devoted to his family and to the Catholic Church. He was a deacon in his church. He sent both his daughters to Catholic schools for their entire life. But he left the church when it became integrated. There were subtle and not so subtle social pressures at work which affected all of his behavior. Very complicated. I'll give you one example. When I first met him in Louisiana, I went fishing with him because he was a great fisherman. And we go out in his boat, and he's got 2 ice chests. One has a blue top, and one has a red top. And as we're catching fish, if you catch a red fish or a trout, those are good fish. They're easy to clean, they're great to eat, so they go in the blue box, says my father-in-law, Fred. Put them in the blue box. If you catch a sheephead, which is extremely difficult to clean and not so tasty, it goes in the red box. I had no idea why. So we fished and we fished and we fished, and we filled up the blue box with red fish and trout, and we filled up the red box with fish he didn't want. Okay? I didn't get it. But then as we came off the water toward the bayou where his boat got docked, there was a sort of a little small hillside, and there were about, I'm going to say, 15 to 20 black guys fishing on this hillside, And they were really poor because they had just poles and string, not even reels. Well, you can't catch a fish that way. It's not going to happen. So my father-in-law says to me as we're coming towards these guys, I'm going to pull the boat up on the shore, take the red box and dump it out. Dump it off the bow. I'm from California. What do I know? So I did what he said. I picked up the red box and I went up to the bow, got ready. He pulls up on the shore and he says, dump it. No, he didn't say. He says to the black guys, y'all want some fish? And they said, yes, sir, mister. He says to me, dump it. I dumped the fish. There's a mess of fish, a lot of fish. And these guys hadn't caught anything. They didn't have anything. And they say, thank you, mister. And he says, y'all are welcome. Get back in the boat and drive away. Is that a racist? It caused me to do some thinking. He died in 1988. I went to his funeral, and at the back of the church were a lot of black people. And nobody would talk to them but me, because I don't care. You know, I'm not from New Orleans. And so I went over to him and I said, were you friends of Fred's? And they said, no, we were his customers. He ran a pest control business, and he turned out, and I learned this at his funeral, he gave services to the black people who couldn't pay for it because they couldn't pay for it. But he would never, ever, ever tell one of his white friends that he had done that. Because if he had, he would have been ostracized. Complicated world, isn't it? Very decent man, trapped in this racist society. But he made some good daughters. Okay. Now, just by way of oversimplification, if you're in the South today and you're dealing with someone my age or older, 70, 80, 90, they're going to say nigger because that's the way it is. But if you talk to somebody who's 50, 60, they're going to say, we know it's not right, but we don't know any blacks except for servants. And if you talk to somebody who's 30, 40, 50, they're going to say, well, I went to school with blacks, and some of them are okay. And then if you talk to somebody who's in school, whether it's kindergarten or grade school or high school or college, they're going to say, Mama, I want you to meet my friend Letitia. On June 27, 2003, the U.S. Supreme Court issued a stunning 6-3 decision which legalized gay sex. And I spoke to you about that year at that time. The court ruled in Lawrence versus Texas that the Texas law which banned sodomy for homosexuals, but not for heterosexuals, was unconstitutional because it violated the Due Process Clause. And then the court went even further, and it said that all sodomy laws violated the Equal Protection Clause of the U.S. Constitution. Justice Anthony Kennedy, the swing guy on the court, wrote the decision. And what he said is this, and I'm quoting, "The petitioners are entitled to respect for their private lives. The state cannot demean their existence or control their destiny by making their private sexual conduct a crime. Their right to liberty under the Due Process Clause gives them the full right to engage in their conduct without the intervention of government." Close quote. In that opinion, Justice Kennedy went out of his way to repudiate an earlier and an opposite decision of the Supreme Court, namely the Bowers case. And what he said was this: Bowers was not correct when it was decided, it is not correct today, and it is hereby overruled. One of the attorneys on the case said this, and I quote him, "I think this is a truly historic and informative decision. In years to come, it will be seen as a turning point for liberty for everybody." Now, some years ago, under George W. Bush, and most of you know this, Congress passed a law called the Defense of Marriage Act. And that law, among other things, prohibited the federal government from recognizing same-sex marriages in states where they were legal, such as New York. And what that means, and it's especially significant for me as an estate planning attorney, and I represent gays, and what this means is that people in a gay marriage, which is perfectly 100% legal, cannot get federal benefits. And those benefits include survivors' benefits for Social Security, estate tax deductions that married couples in traditional marriages enjoy, and on and on and on. Okay? These are significant monetary benefits which are enjoyed by traditional spouses, but were systematically denied to same-sex couples at the federal level in this country. Just last week, the United States Court of Appeal for the Second Circuit, sitting in Manhattan, ruled in the case of Windsor versus the United States that the part of the Defense of Marriage Act that prohibited the federal government from recognizing legal same-sex was absolutely unconstitutional. It's a big deal, this case. That decision was a 2-to-1 decision, but significantly, the chief judge, Dennis Jacobs, wrote the opinion for the majority. And Jacobs was a conservative appointed by George W. Bush. That's significant to me. And he wrote that opinion for the majority. Now, in recent years, other courts, since the Lawrence versus Taylor case, there has just been a tremendous amount of litigation by the gay community, and it's been successful, by and large, and it should be. In recent years, other courts have made like rulings, and they have slowly and methodically advanced the legal rights of gays. And today, the pressure is on the U.S. Supreme Court, because this case that I'm telling you about, Windsor versus the United States, undoubtedly is going to be appealed. And the only place to appeal it is the United States Supreme Court. And guess what's sitting on their docket? The Proposition 8 case from California, where we voted that same-sex marriage was okay. And that's been upheld by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. And it's on its way. It's sitting in the Supreme Court now, but so now is going to be the Windsor case. And this is the same court with these same conservative justices that ruled in Lawrence versus Texas that you can't outlaw homosexual sex. So I think my prediction is, and you heard it here, okay, that the U.S. Supreme Court is ultimately going to rule that any law that treats gay people differently in this country as unconstitutional is going to get struck down. Now, that sweeping ruling may not come in this term, but it will undoubtedly come within the next 5 years. And I don't mean to be political about this, I'm just stating the obvious. If Obama is reelected and he gets to make appointments to the court, it will absolutely occur as soon as possible. There's no question about it. Now, we all know the mandate of Leviticus 19:18, which is the golden rule. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Putting that rule into practice has proven difficult throughout history, because the reality is, for most people, is that we love those of our neighbors who are like us. Others are tolerated, some are despised. Overall, as the human race, we have not done a very great job implementing the golden rule. Now, the legal decisions that I just cited to you this morning, Brown versus the Board of Education, which struck down school segregation, Lawrence versus Taylor, which struck down sodomy laws, and now the case of Windsor versus the United States, which struck down the federal discrimination against gays in the Defense of Marriage Act. These are all decisions which are based on fundamental Judeo-Christian values. The decisions were anchored in the Golden Rule. They were framed by the ideals of tolerance and compassion. It's noteworthy and perhaps a bit ironic that it is the high courts of our country now, in their collective wisdom, which have reminded us as a nation that we should not judge others. To put this all into perspective, remember what the Tin Man said to Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz? We're not in Kansas anymore. Remember? Well, the days of Ozzie and Harriet, in which emotions were stifled, segregation was the law of the land, and gays had no rights, are thankfully long gone. Thank you for your attention.